Hannah stood at the restaurant counter, gripping a tray of dirty dishes. The voices of her colleagues echoed in the background, but she couldn't help but overhear their quiet giggles. The loudest of them all was Ashley, the waitress with perfect white teeth and nails Hannah could never afford. "You going to the company party alone?" Ashley drawled, turning to her with a fake look of surprise. "Well, of course, who would want to go with you?" Laughter filled the kitchen. Hannah bit her lip, suppressing the urge to respond. It was better not to engage. She knew how this played out. If she said anything, it would only get worse. Chef Mark Collins walked into the kitchen, scanned the room, and announced, "Just a reminder, the company party is in 3 days. Dress nicely, partners are encouraged." His gaze flicked to Hannah, but he didn't say anything. No one did. They all knew she wouldn't be bringing anyone. An hour later, after finishing her shift, Hannah stepped out of the restaurant. The night air was cool, the streetlights flickering, casting reflections on the wet pavement. She walked slowly, head down, listening to the sound of footsteps behind her. At the corner of the park, she sat on a bench and closed her eyes. Everything felt so tiresome. The loneliness weighed on her like a heavy burden. She had gotten used to it, but sometimes she just wanted something more. Suddenly, something rustled in the bushes. Hannah jumped. "Who's there?" Her voice was tight but firm. A man stepped out of the shadows. His clothes were worn, his hair unkempt, but his posture and gaze, they were too confident for an ordinary homeless person. "Don't be scared," he said with a smile. "I was just looking for a place to rest." Hannah stared at him, and he at her. There was something strange in that look. Something that made her heart freeze for a moment. Hannah stared at the stranger, clenching her fingers into a fist. He looked scruffy, but his eyes didn't have the usual emptiness that came with people who had been on the streets for too long. On the contrary, they held intelligence, strength, a hidden depth that she hadn't expected to find in a random drifter. "I won't hurt you," he raised his hands, showing his empty palms. "Just looking for a place to rest." "Here? In the bushes?" She scoffed, trying to hide her wariness. The man shrugged. "Not the worst place, trust me." He sat down on the neighboring bench, lowered his head, and froze for a moment. In the yellow light of the street lamp, his face didn't seem so worn. The dirt, the stubble, the disheveled hair, all of it could be fixed. But the expression on his face, that was different. Like he didn't even understand how he ended up here. "Do you have a name?" she asked. He thought for a moment, furrowing his brows as if trying to remember. "Leo," he finally said. "I think I'm Leo." "You think?" he smiled. "You know, I remember how the sun shines on the mountains, the taste of good wine, the smell of freshly cut grass, but I can't remember who I am. It's a strange feeling." Hannah frowned. Memory loss? Or was he just lying? "Are you serious?" "Absolutely. I woke up a couple of months ago, no memories, no documents. Nobody's looking for me, no one remembers. Well, I had to learn how to survive." She thought for a moment. What if? Then it hit her. A crazy idea. Crazy and risky. "Listen, Leo," she began slowly. "I need to go to an event, and I need a date." He raised an eyebrow. "You want me to play your boyfriend?" "Yes," she exhaled. "It's a company party, and there will be people there who think I'm nobody. I want them to see that I have a boyfriend." Leo smirked. "So I'm your revenge tool?" "No," she protested. "It's just support." He studied her closely. "All right, sounds interesting, but I have one condition." "What's that?" "Give me a roof over my head for a couple of days. And maybe some decent clothes." Hannah hesitated. Bring a stranger into her home? But something inside her told her he wasn't dangerous. "Okay," she nodded. "Let's go." And so their deal began, a deal that would turn her life upside down. Leo stood in front of the mirror in Hannah's small but cozy bathroom. His reflection no longer resembled the man she had met in the park. Clean skin, neatly trimmed beard, hair combed back. Now he looked like a man from an entirely different world. And maybe that's exactly what he was. "Well, how do I look?" Hannah knocked on the door. "Amazing," he replied, opening it. "I never thought I had a face like this." Hannah smiled, but deep down a strange feeling lingered. Leo didn't just look well-groomed, he looked expensive. His posture, his manners, his gaze, it all felt too refined for an ordinary homeless man. "You ready?" she asked, looking away. "As ready as I'll ever be," he smirked. The corporate event was being held at an elite restaurant, a place where, in her usual life, Hannah would never have set foot. She felt out of place among the women in expensive dresses and men in perfectly tailored suits. But to her surprise, Leo didn't seem lost at all. He held himself with confidence, joked around, and poured her wine gallantly. He played his role so naturally that even her snarky colleagues started casting envious glances. "Hannah, where on earth did you find him?" Jenny, her colleague known for her biting sarcasm, asked with a fake smile. "Oh, we met by chance," Hannah replied, smiling as if everything was going exactly as she'd planned. "How romantic," Jenny said, eyeing Leo with interest. "So, what do you do, handsome?" Leo paused for a moment, as if trying to come up with an answer, but he was saved by Mark Collins, the restaurant owner. "Excuse me, young man," Mark suddenly said, narrowing his eyes. "I feel like I've seen you somewhere before." Leo looked at him, frowning. "Don't think so," he answered slowly. Mark studied him with obvious suspicion, then took out his phone and stepped aside. Hannah felt a wave of unease stirring in her chest. Something wasn't right, but before she could sort out her feelings, an elderly man and woman entered the room. They scanned the crowd until the woman's gaze suddenly locked onto Leo. "Oh my God," she whispered, rushing toward him. Leo turned and froze. Suddenly, his face contorted as if a lightning bolt had struck his mind. "Mom?" he gasped. Hannah felt the world around her crumble. What had she done? Leo couldn't take his eyes off the woman standing in front of him. Her eyes filled with tears, her lips trembling as if she were afraid to say a word. The man standing next to her looked stunned. "Leo," she whispered, unable to believe her eyes. "Is it really you?" Flashes of images exploded in Leo's mind. A broken car, screams, hands grabbing him and dragging him into the dark. His heart raced, and his breath quickened. He swallowed hard, his gaze flicking between the woman and the man. "Who are you?" "Son." The man's voice cracked as he took a step forward. "We're your parents." The room seemed to sway before Leo's eyes. Hannah watched as his fingers gripped the edge of the table, his breathing heavy as if he'd just realized that everything he knew was a lie. "No?" He shook his head, stumbling backward. "This is a mistake. This is some kind of mistake. Leo, listen to us." The woman tried to grab his hand, but he pulled away as though her touch was unbearable. "I need to go." Leo turned abruptly and almost ran out of the restaurant. Hannah glanced at the elderly couple. The woman was already crying, and the man hugged her helplessly. She didn't know what to do. Nothing like this had ever happened to her before. But she knew one thing: Leo was terrified. She rushed after him. Leo was sitting on a cold bench in the park, staring into space. When Hannah approached, he didn't move, not even glancing her way. "Are you okay?" she asked gently. He let out a bitter laugh. "I have no idea." Hannah sat next to him, unsure of what to say. They sat in silence for a few minutes. The distant hum of the city and the wind filled the space between them. "Are they really your parents?" she finally asked. Leo ran a hand over his face. "I don't remember, but when she looked at me, something inside me broke. It was familiar, like a part of me knew them." "Are you afraid to know the truth?" He was silent for a long moment before turning to her, something painful flickering in his eyes. "And what if I don't like the truth? What if I don't want to be that person?" Hannah touched his hand. "It doesn't matter who you were. What matters is who you are now." Leo looked at her, and in his gaze was a flicker of warm gratitude. But in a moment, determination replaced it. "I need to go to them. I need to know everything." When Hannah drove him to the mansion on the outskirts of town, he gripped her hand tightly. "Will you stay with me?" She nodded. The door opened, and the elderly woman rushed toward him, repeating his name over and over. Her tears touched his hands, and he suddenly realized it was true. His name was Leo, and his life would never be the same again. A week had passed. Hannah was heading home from work when she heard the squeal of brakes just in front of her house. Her heart tightened. A black sedan had stopped right in front of her porch. The car door opened and out stepped Leo. But now, he was different. His sharp suit highlighted his figure, expensive watch gleamed on his wrist, and the confidence in his stride made it clear that he was no longer the lost man he once was. He knew who he was. He had found himself. "Hannah?" His voice was still soft, but now there was a new strength to it. She could hardly believe her eyes. Just a week ago he had been a vagabond, her random savior. Now standing before her was the heir to a major restaurant empire. "Did you come back?" she whispered barely above a breath. Leo took a step closer to her. I couldn't leave you. Hannah turned her gaze away. She didn't know what to say. You're different now, she muttered. Everything's changed. Leo gently took her hand. No, only the circumstances. I'm still the same. Hannah wanted to believe him, but before she could respond, two elderly people emerged from the car. Leo's parents. Is this the girl? Asked the man, glancing at her with mild curiosity. Yes, father, Leo answered firmly. This is Hannah. She helped me when no one else would. The woman smiled, hands clasped in front of her chest. Thank you, dear, she said warmly. If not for you, our son might have never remembered who he was. Hannah nodded awkwardly. Everything felt like a dream. Too surreal to be real. I want you to come with us, Leo continued. Meet our family. Hannah pressed her hands to her chest as if to protect herself. Leo, I don't know. I don't belong in your world. Give me a chance to prove that it doesn't matter. She looked into his eyes. They were full of hope. Okay, she finally sighed. I'll go. At Leo's parents' mansion, a surprise awaited her. As they entered the living room, a slender blonde in an elegant dress appeared at the top of the stairs. Her gaze slid over Hannah, lingering for a few moments. Leo, her voice was filled with fake excitement. You didn't even warn me that you were back. Leo tensed. Victoria? Hannah immediately understood who this was. His ex-fiancée. I'm so glad you're okay, Victoria continued, softly touching his hand. We were so worried. Leo pulled away carefully. I have guests right now. Yes, I see. Her gaze returned to Hannah. What's your name? Hannah, she replied, trying to sound confident. Oh, so you're the one. Victoria tilted her head, eyeing her. Interesting. Something in her voice set off alarms. Hannah felt that this was just the beginning of something unpleasant. When Victoria left, Leo squeezed her hand. Don't listen to her. She's just his ex-fiancée? Hannah smirked. You think I didn't notice the way she looked at you? Leo sighed. I'm not going back to her. Everything I need is right in front of me. He looked at her with such sincerity that she felt warmth inside. But the nagging feeling that Victoria wouldn't just give up lingered. And she was right. Hannah felt her heart constrict with pain. Victoria was sitting across from her in a cozy cafe, stirring her latte with a spoon and smiling with a clear sense of superiority. Did you really think Leo chose you? Her voice was sweet, but something poisonous crept beneath the surface. He was just playing. You were his little adventure until he went back to his real life. Hannah clenched her fists under the table, trying to keep her composure. He's not like that, she said firmly. You don't know anything about him. Oh, sweetie, I know more than you can imagine, Victoria sighed dramatically. Leo was mine, and he'll always be mine. He went back to his family, to his luxury, and you're just a chapter in his story. The words hit Hannah harder than she expected. Her chest tightened, and her thoughts scrambled. Could this be true? Could Leo really be just playing with her? Victoria left money for the coffee and stood up. Take care of yourself, Hannah, she tossed over her shoulder as she left the cafe. Hannah sat frozen, staring at her clenched fists. A sense of emptiness overtook her. She made a decision. If Leo really loved her, he would come. If not, then Victoria was right. Leo was furious. No, not furious. He was livid. When he found out that Victoria had met with Hannah, he was shaking with rage. He couldn't let her ruin what was truly important to him. He stormed into the cafe where Hannah worked. She stood behind the counter, looking lost but composed. Their eyes met, and in hers, he saw doubt. We need to talk, he said, moving closer. Hannah silently removed her apron and gestured for him to follow her. They stepped outside. What do you want, Leo? Her voice was cold, tinged with bitterness. If you came to tell me that Victoria was right, don't bother. Victoria's right? He smirked. You really believe her? Hannah, I love you. I'm not going to let her destroy what we have. But you left. Her voice cracked. You went back to your family, to your life, to everything that doesn't belong to me. You're my life, Leo said firmly, taking her hands in his. Yes, I went back to my family, but I learned one thing. Without you, none of it means anything. Hannah hesitated. She wanted to believe him, but the fear of being deceived again held her back. Prove it, she whispered. Leo reached into his pocket, pulled out a small box and knelt before her. He opened it, revealing a sparkling ring. Marry me, Hannah. Tears filled Hannah's eyes. Her heart pounded so loudly she felt like it might leap from her chest. She looked at Leo, the man she had fallen in love with, the man who had shown her that her worth wasn't determined by what others thought. "Yes," she whispered, and in that instant he stood up and wrapped her in a strong embrace. Months passed. Hannah and Leo stood in the cozy mansion he had brought her to after their wedding. Mrs. Grace, her mother, sat in a chair, watching her daughter with pride. "I always knew you'd find your happiness," she smiled. Victoria no longer appeared. Her schemes had failed, and soon she moved on to her next target. Colleagues who had once mocked Hannah now looked at her with respect. And Hannah? She no longer felt like the unhappy girl she once was. She knew she deserved love. Real, sincere, unconditional love. She looked at Leo and smiled. "Are you ready for the next chapter?" he asked. "Always," she replied. The game of fate was over, and Hannah had finally won.